I just have a kind of funny remark which relates to David's kind of ending and the way in which there was a kind of emotional investment in and a kind of negative attitude to the high art of the Aspen versus the ordinary and democratic art of the magazine, which is that in my incredibly clever end that I wasn't able to concoct, I wanted to say something about the fact that I wanted to say that, of course, Barthes and all the other people are aspiring towards immortality, which is all the high art thing. And the very funny thing is with Phyllis Johnson, who just gets bad press as this rich woman, which you gave her, she was I've discovered from a PhD on Aspen produced at the Pompidou Centre under Didier Schulman in 2008. She was the lingerie editor for Women's Wear Daily. And I mean, I love thinking of her doing all these articles on women's knickers and bras, and then herself having upward social mobility into this much more elevated world, meeting gorgeous, hunky young artists. So I just think that there's a kind of upward social mobility story there to do with the actual magazine that's quite a love.
I'd like to actually expand from what Sarah just said. Johnson, yes, I think the success of Aspen is because she was a commercial publisher and she had no clue about art. So she let the editors do what they want, and that's really, in a way, it's attested by a lot of the artists that we interviewed and the writings who said, I never met her. Brian O'Doherty said to me, I spoke to her once. And of course, no one got paid after 5 and 6. So I think, in a way, yes, she was the rich, what was it, Women's Weekly?
Yeah. Actually,
exactly.
A way more interesting magazine than the title would suggest.
We're sure it was.
So, but she wasn't in any position, which I think is the success of Aspen, to kind of instruct. And also I wanted to comment on what you were saying. I think you made that comparison with conceptual artists and photographers, and I think there's much more common to photography and conceptual art anyway, as photography being conceptual medium by default, based on signifiers and signified, and even a little snapshot somewhere is in a way a conceptual, we understand it through a similar process.
There's no such thing as a conceptual medium by default.
Anyway, I have my opinion on photography, but what I want to say is I don't feel that there should be a direct comparison, because that has always, that's been historic kind of comparison with photography. In fact, if we do embark on the comparison, I think we should also regard a point that photographers had only the printed page as the main medium for their work to be, in a way, disseminated and come in touch with the public from the beginning of the 20th century, whether that was a magazine or the book. So that was the place. As we know, exhibitions of photography, of course, they were existing in various times and decades of the 20th century, even the big exhibition Family of Man and so on and so forth, but they weren't very frequent in the same way that contemporary art of the time, visual art was. So this is an important point, that for the one group you mentioned, and I don't want to totally to put them aside, that was their medium. They knew it well. They had the decades in developing it. So it's more interesting that then the artists who were mostly used in the gallery, studio, and museum space. I think it's more interesting to realize that in '65. Photography started to be collected majorly by museums, and photographic exhibitions starting at a grand scale. And artists who were traditionally there started looking for alternatives. So I think these two groups have a lot in parallel in their antithetical movement. So that was a comment I just wanted to make, because it did seem as the ones were the good group and the others were the bad. And I don't want to put it
Can I just say before we leave that, because I'm sure that I just thought what you were doing was absolutely sublime traditional art history, and thank you, because it's the kind of basic, and as I said, it's both basic and sublime that hasn't been done, and it gave me incredible aesthetic pleasure. And bravo, and it also shows that when art historians find sources, the artists completely, never knew them in the first place. I mean, the whole thing was a gorgeous paradigm of all sorts of things to do with our discipline.
It was, for me too. I just didn't want
Give
to
him a chance to go ahead.
Oh, God.
God. Well, look, everything you both say I think is true and right, apart from the idea that photography is a kind of paradigmatic conceptual medium, because I don't think there is such a thing. And as Jeff Wall, as a photographer, argued quite recently, strictly speaking, and you need to be strict when you talk about conceptual art, the conceptual gesture is a linguistic one, and in many ways photography was a kind of along for the ride. That would be my first point. The second point is in the Anglo-Saxon world, which I was talking about. What's very interesting is the constant traffic on the magazine page between high art and popular culture. That's what, if you looked at sort of American magazines, even things like Gentry or Flair, short-lived magazines that had rich backers that were interested in a kind of taking some of those lessons of the avant-garde and putting them into play with a mainstream magazine. It's interesting, and I'm not the guy to do it, but there's a very interesting history to be written, which will probably be the sort of rapprochement between us. What's most interesting is the traffic between the two, I think. Just to bring you into the conversation, I was having a public conversation with Martin Parr and Jerry Badger last month. They asked me to chair a discussion in London, and I opened that by saying that the term photo book is ridiculous. I mean, nobody would use the word book to make a category out of all books with words in them. And nobody used the term photo book until about 15 years ago, around the moment that actually the Andrew Roth book, the book of 101 books, was published. But even the Roth book doesn't actually use the term photo book. They say, what do they use? Photographically illustrated books or something. It's a crazy category, but if it's a useful one, it's because it falls apart. Actually, in the same way that the term conceptual art is ridiculous. If any art is conceptual, all art is conceptual. But it's the term that we've been stuck with, for 40, 50 years now. And I don't want to get into a kind of battle over terms, but
would you like to exchange the term conceptual art?
No, I wouldn't. There isn't an exchange for
There's
it.
No exchange.
There is an exchange, but it's not it's as much of a disadvantage, that term, as it is an advantage. Particularly for an art that didn't want any boundaries or terms. You speak to most so-called conceptual artists, they kind of shudder when you, particularly of that generation. They don't want a label, it's ridiculous. You take it as it is.
Jerzy Lubiński, who is exhibited downstairs, he was saying simply the post-artistic period or post-artistic work. Perhaps artists would not be very happy with this as well.
Yeah, I think that's true. So what you have to do is what I was trying to do, which is just proceed on a case-by-case basis. Just forget the terms. Just look at what people were thinking about, looking at what they were trying to do. Now the idea that artists have ideas about images and texts that simply don't come up anywhere else is ridiculous.
Well, it's kind of statistically impossible.
Of course
But that's what's so interesting, because now we know, how is it possible that a whole aeroplane load of people want to fly from Wrocław to Bristol at 7 o'clock in the morning tomorrow? And it's a regular flight. I mean, I find it inconceivable, but there must be a body of people. So we know that the internet has taught us very weird things that we couldn't conceive about aleatoric desires of vast numbers of people.
Okay. So I joined the discussion.
Maybe answer.
In English, but of course I agree with you that photo book category is kind of marketed or invented issue for artwork basically, or book collectors, or but it's at the same time it's very interesting with how many things it brings to the discourse, to conversation that we have. Yes, that there are many artists who are missing in the canon, is because they are not conceptual, because they were like with this even magazine thing with Eve Arnott. Yes, she's not present in any way. Like Irving Penn is funny guy. Yes, for art history conference, and this is interesting for me as an art historian, and also for my colleague, because we out of a sudden, find out so many interesting things that were simply missing or just like hidden. Yes, and because they are popular, because they were too. They were not Aspen, yes. They were too mass-oriented or popular or whatever, propaganda. And in this sense, it's a crazy category, but it's useful, yes. And I don't know what Badger Parr answered to your funny beginning for the promotion of the volume 3 by Phaidon, that is whatever. But I think you do the same, and you curated the show with the magazines of Walker Evans, and it's funny to see them in the, the display is terrific, yes, but they look like the most precious things hidden behind like a thick glass, and it's just a Fortune magazine or whatever kind of magazine that it's out of a sudden an art object, and you do it, yes, and this is the also inventing art magazines as a category, yes, so, and it works, and I think it's fine. Be it from the point of view of an art historian who thinks that it's like new sources for conceptual art, but it's also something new because it makes us think about what these people have done, and like Walker Evans is a simply new person in this sense. Yes, there is no way back to thinking about him in this, let's say, modernist way. I don't know, yes, but there's some things going on. So I think it's okay. It's good that they invented this category, and I was trying to show, because of course in Poland, it's a very poor country and devastated, and Wrocław is in 80% destroyed and so on. So of course this is this moment that this category is invented, yes, and of course this is the moment that people are buying whole libraries of artists, or like the museums do with archives, and let's buy everything, yes, because in 5 years it will be so expensive that we won't be able to have it. Yes, so this is also, I think, a very important point for this museum, is because they are having this archive and hosting this conference to get to know which way to go, like the Aspen or Walker Evans magazines. Yes, so I'm here in the middle in this sense.
We have one question from the audience. I'm
Right.
afraid we have
But
time
the
just
microphone
for
is
one question.
here. So.
I'd like to make a kind of remark, and if I properly understand, the publisher of the Aspen, it was a lady who was rich, and she was doing kind of articles about lingerie or whatever.
Previously, yes.
Yeah. So, shifting the context and traveling through the ocean to poor Poland, communist country that time in the 60s, and in the period after thaw and after Stalinic times, era, we had a kind of amazing magazine which was called TIA.
You and me.
Yeah.
The title in English
Yeah.
was You and Me.
Yeah, it was a magazine for communist women, but it was, for example, designed by.
For Polish women, not for communist women.
Yeah, but it was published by to publish the magazine in that time, it was of course a propaganda thing. It was not. But the magazine was really strange, because it was produced by very young, for example, graphic designers at that time, like Roman Cieślewicz. This magazine looks like a kind of surrealistic magazine at some point, because the clash of materials inside was really strange. Like like the documentation of the openings or interviews with artists or great film directors, mixed with fashion shoots, but simply appropriated from the French Vogue or French Elle, but in the surrealistic way, because of the copyrights. So, for example, Cieślewicz cut heads of the models and put the flowers instead. And after that, you can have a recipe how to make a jam or kind of simple food with the as we remember the empty shelves in the shops. So how to design your own very small flat. So it was really funny and kind of strange. And I find it very interesting to compare this magazine to Aspen, because you always couldn't expect what you can find in Me and You magazine, and it was made in a completely different context, and in the communist pure Poland, and it looks like a very luxury magazine for the bourgeois, noble people, for kind of elite, but it was a big circulation of the magazine.
I'd just like to say a tiny thing about this. I went to a fabulous exhibition of socialist Eastern Europe in Zagreb, and there were teddy bears, and there was a Philips Lady Shave razor for women to use, just like my auntie used to have, which one was supposed to perceive as socialist teddy bears and socialist ladies' razor blades, when they were actually products that everyone had on either side. So I think that there's a funny to and froing there, where you can't sort of think of everything as specifically socialist. And the women's magazine thing's fabulous. I mean, in France at the same, and of course parodied by people, parodied by artists at the same time as they were produced. So we need to do more about Phyllis Johnson, I think. You can do more about her.
It's really interesting. I was hoping somebody was going to give a talk about You and Me, because it's something I want to know more about, and I've seen a few issues. And when I was a student, I came across in a second-hand bookshop a catalogue of Cieślewicz, if I say the name right.
There's one text by David Crowley.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's really amazing, and it kind of made me think at the time that one of the problems in the study of photography, as it's been institutionalized, and also art history as it's been institutionalized, is that they have separated themselves from the history of graphic design. You know, graphic design tends to be regarded by art history and sort of photographic history as a kind of narrowly applied art, not a kind of high art, but a kind of an applied one, in a very sort of derogatory way, like as if you were a graphic designer, you didn't have interesting thoughts or something. You know, you just kind of did the work or something. And I think art history and the study of photography has really suffered by cutting itself off. And interestingly, what you see in contemporary art, particularly over the last 10, 15 years, where so many artists want to make publications again, all of them work like art directors, really. And it makes me think that probably the kind of Phyllis Johnson kind of comes into this in a kind of sleeping way. The kind of middle term in all of this is editing, because editing is a word that applies to writing. Editing is a word that applies to images. Editing is a word that applies to the curating of exhibitions. Everyone's surrounded by too much knowledge, too much information. When everyone claims that they want to be a curator or something these days, I think what they're thinking about is actually being an editor. There's a really beautiful remark that is made by Colin McCabe, kind of film theorist, and he wrote an amazing biography of Jean-Luc Godard. And he's talking about Godard's Histoire du cinéma, you know, the films that he made. Godard made these films that were his own personal reflection on the history of cinema, all using found clips from films, and almost none of his own footage. And McCabe says, and I can quote it very precisely because it just stuck in my mind. He said, in a world in which we are entertained from the cradle to the grave, whether we like it or not, the ability to rework image and text is a matter of political and psychical health. If you don't have your way with images, they will have their way with you. So I do feel that the position of the editor sort of throughout the art of the 20th century, and also the art history of the 20th century, when you think of sort of Warburg or Malraux, who were such interesting image handlers, the editors of the mainstream magazines, the editors of the avant-garde press, I think they're the really interesting figures to follow, because they're confronting the question that confronts us all, is what do you do with all of these pictures? What sense do you want to make? And I think Cisłewicz is kind of interesting in that unwritten history somehow.